The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not.
The biggest threat we face as a country from a counterintelligence perspective is from the People's Republic of China, and especially the Chinese Communist Party.
What we need to do is to recognize that China is the largest threat, both to the world and to the United Kingdom, for freedom and democracy.
Is China really the threat it's made out to be? The West often paints the country as a looming danger, whether it's through its expanding military or its so-called human rights violations. But is that the full picture, or is there more to the story? Let's take a closer look at two of the biggest accusations: China's growing military presence and its human rights record. When you break it down, things aren't as simple as the headlines suggest. Let's get started. China's growing military might, a threat to global stability? China's military buildup is one of the most discussed topics in geopolitics today. The country's increasing defense spending, modernized weaponry, and strategic military positioning in the South China Sea have led many to believe that China poses a major threat to global stability. But when we zoom out and compare, things don't seem as alarming as they might first appear. Yes, China's military is growing. This is true. The country has significantly ramped up its defense spending over the past 2 decades, and its military capabilities are becoming more advanced by the year. With a population of over 1.4 billion people, it makes sense for China to modernize its military to ensure it's capable of defending its interests. After all, every country in the world has a responsibility to safeguard its sovereignty and its people. But let's put things in perspective. While China's military has certainly expanded, it's not like they're running around creating military bases everywhere or invading their neighbors. In fact, China's military presence abroad is relatively limited when compared to other global powers, especially the United States. The US maintains a mind-boggling 800 military bases around the world in over 70 countries. That's right, 800. So when people claim that China's military rise is a threat to global peace, it's hard not to notice the irony. Here's a country with hundreds of military bases spread across the globe, involved in multiple conflicts, but somehow China, whose military activities mostly involve protecting its own borders and interests, is the bad guy. The US military budget is also the largest in the world, spending around $800 billion annually. That's more than the next 11 countries combined. And what has all that money bought us? A series of wars in the Middle East, an endless military presence in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and countless drone strikes across Africa and Asia. The US has been involved in wars, regime changes, and military interventions for decades. It's become the norm. But when China spends money on its own defense, it gets called out as an aggressive power. Interesting, isn't it? In reality, China's approach to military expansion is far less aggressive than Western powers might have you believe. China has historically been focused on trade, diplomacy, and economic development, especially with its neighbors in Southeast Asia. In fact, China has been engaged in trade with Southeast Asia for centuries without ever resorting to invasion or colonization, unlike, say, European powers or the US. When the West colonized much of Asia, China's policies remained relatively peaceful. Today, China continues to invest in trade agreements, infrastructure, and mutual cooperation in the region. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI for example, focuses on building infrastructure and creating economic opportunities in developing countries around the world. China's economic influence in Africa, Asia, and Europe is growing, and it's based on mutually beneficial partnerships. China is hardly the first country to expand its influence globally, but unlike the US, which often uses military force as a tool of diplomacy, China's approach is largely about trade and development. Yes, China is building up its military, but so are many other countries, and China is focused more on regional defense than on global domination. So, when people talk about China's military expansion as a threat to global stability, it's worth asking, why does the US have 800 military bases around the world, yet still gets to hold the moral high ground? China is a threat to democracy and human rights? The human rights angle. This is where things really start to get complicated. The West often cites China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang as one of its most egregious human rights violations. The narrative goes something like this. China is engaging in genocide, ethnic cleansing, and a variety of other grave offenses against its own people. But hold on a second. How much of this is actually true, and how much is just a product of political maneuvering? Let's start with Xinjiang. The Western media often frames China's policies in the region as oppressive, with accusations of forced labor, forced assimilation, and mass incarceration. But if you look more closely, the story becomes less straightforward. The Chinese government describes its actions in Xinjiang as part of a broader counterterrorism effort. The region has experienced violent attacks from separatist groups, and the Chinese government has taken measures to prevent extremism by promoting education and vocational training. These re-education centers are in fact largely vocational schools designed to provide skills to Uyghur people and help them integrate into the broader Chinese economy. It's not an ideal solution, but it's not the dystopian nightmare that Western media often portrays. Many Uyghurs who have gone through these training programs report that they learned valuable skills and found better job opportunities. This isn't to say that everything is perfect. China's human rights record is far from spotless. But is it really the case that China is committing genocide in Xinjiang? Or is this another case of a country trying to deal with a complex problem in a way that doesn't fit neatly into the West's narrative of human rights? It's a lot more complicated than just labeling China as the villain. The forced labor claims are also highly questionable. While the Chinese government has been accused of using Uyghur labor in certain industries, no solid evidence has been presented that proves these workers are being coerced. In fact, Xinjiang's economy has been rapidly growing, and improvements in infrastructure, healthcare, and education are evident in the region. The standard of living for Uyghurs in Xinjiang has been steadily improving, which raises the question, why is the West focusing on a few isolated issues while ignoring the broader improvements that are benefiting millions of people? Let's not forget that while China's policies might be different from Western liberal democracy, they have been incredibly effective in lifting over 800 million people out of poverty over the past few decades. That's a major achievement. But for some reason, the West doesn't seem to recognize that when it comes to China. Instead, the focus is on the political system, one that, while not democratic in the Western sense, has provided a level of stability and prosperity that many countries can't claim. Now, let's look at the US's human rights record. For decades, the US has been involved in wars that have resulted in countless civilian deaths, not to mention the ongoing consequences of the military-industrial complex. The US supported oppressive regimes for political and strategic reasons, often turning a blind eye to human rights abuses in countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And when the US engages in military interventions, the human cost is enormous. Just ask the people of Iraq or Afghanistan. But the US is rarely held accountable for its own actions in the name of spreading democracy. So when the West criticizes China for human rights violations, it's worth considering who gets to define what human rights really means? And how can we trust the US to point fingers at China when it's been responsible for so many human rights failures of its own? At the end of the day, the claim that China is a threat is more about political narratives than actual danger. When you look at the facts, China's military rise is more about regional defense and securing its sovereignty than any ambition for global conquest. And while China's human rights record is certainly not perfect, it's not as clear-cut as the media would have you believe. The real question we should be asking is, why is China being singled out when Western powers have had a much more complicated and, let's say, mixed history with human rights and military intervention? The truth is, China is a complicated and often misunderstood actor on the global stage. Its rise is a natural consequence of its growing economic power and population size. Rather than labeling China as a threat, maybe we should consider the bigger picture and realize that the world is more nuanced than the headlines let on. So next time you hear about China being a threat, take a moment to question the narrative. It's more than just military buildup and human rights issues. It's a story of a rising power, navigating its place in a world dominated by another superpower. And maybe, just maybe, the real threat to global stability isn't China at all. So what do you think? Do you agree with our video? Tell us what you think by leaving your comments below. And if you like what you watched, make sure to hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to show your support.